Hey, this is Devin. Today we're going to be building a habit tracker application using the Svelte JavaScript framework. It's going to allow you to enter as many habits as you want to track. It'll display those in a nice list, and you'll be able to click whether you completed the habit or whether you missed it, and it'll reset your counter. And then if there's a habit that's no longer relevant, you can click delete and it will wipe that one off your list. Svelte is somewhat unique amongst the currently popular JavaScript frameworks in that instead of running the framework at runtime, it actually compiles the framework down to vanilla JavaScript. So all the browser is running at runtime is just vanilla JavaScript. That makes it lighter weight and faster than something like React or Vue or Angular. Let's go over to the computer. We are going to build this Svelte app inside of Code Sandbox. That's at codesandbox.io. The reason I'm using this tool, this doesn't really reflect what you would do in real life if you wanted to build a Svelte app, but this does make it super easy for you to work along with me. If you haven't used Code Sandbox before, you can really easily log in with your GitHub account, and you're going to see something like this, but without all these projects that I've already created. The first thing to do is click on New Sandbox. I have this Svelte template at the top of my recently used templates, but you probably won't have that. You can come over here to the filter box and filter for Svelte, and then click on the result there. That's going to give you this generic starter app. I want to take a look around this template really quick and just see how this all fits together. We've got an app.svelte component, which is sort of our outer wrapper component. It imports a button component from button.svelte, has a couple of style rules. Then it also has this HTML that renders out these headings over here and the button component. Let's click into the button component and see what that looks like. This is how you create component state in Svelte. You just declare a variable inside that component's script tags. They are using this count variable just to make a simple counter button. You can kind of see down here what it does. When you click on this button, it calls this handle click function, which adds 1 to the count. We can click on that and see that happening here. That is pretty cool, but that's not what we are doing for our build here. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of rip all this out and start with a clean slate. We don't need this button component. I'm just going to delete that file as well to clean things up a little bit. We will keep the app wrapper component. The first thing I want to add here is a form that would allow people to add their habits to the tracker. I'm just going to call that add habit form.svelte. We'll start out with some empty script tags, empty style tags, and our markup will go down here. This is going to be a form. I'm going to start with a label that says habit. Inside that label, I'm just going to nest my input, type text. I'm going to bind the value of this input to a variable we will call habit name. The editor does not like that because habit name has not been declared. So we need to come up into this script tag and say let habit name, just to declare that variable. When you declare a variable inside the script tag of a component, that is creating state for that component. And by binding the state to the value attribute of this input, we're making those two always stay in sync. If the value of the input field changes, it will change the habit name as well. If the value of the habit name changes, then you'll see the value in the text field change to reflect that change. The way this binding works, you've got the keyword first. In our case, it's bind, and then a colon. This is just the name of the attribute. This could be any attribute on an input element that you would want to bind to something else. Then after the equal sign, you open your curly braces and tell it what variable you want to bind that to. Let's close the label, and I would like to get this into the app so we can see it over here in the preview browser. We will open app.svelte. First, I need to import the component we just created. We'll import addHabitForm.svelte. No, sorry. We'll import addHabitForm from, and then in quotes, /addHabitForm.svelte. That // if you're not aware, that's just telling, the dot means the current directory. So current directory that this app.svelte file is in, and then within that directory, here's the path. It's just addHabitForm.svelte. And the way we're able to import this, the component itself is always the default export from your Svelte file. So the compiler knows that that's what's being imported here. Now we need to actually add it, and we do that just by using the name of the component. Now we have the form we just created. Let's flip back over to the form component. We also probably need a button that people will click to add the new habit. Now we need to be thinking, what does that button need to do? We need to be keeping a list of the habits somewhere. I think the simplest way to do it would be to keep that list on this top level app component, and it can pass it down into any of its child components as a property. I'll show you how to do that when we get there. But we can go ahead now and create that. We will say let habits equals, we'll start it out as an empty array. There are a couple of ways we could approach getting the add habit form the ability to add something into this array. We could just pass this whole state variable into the add habit form and let it modify it directly. Or we could write a function to add a habit and then pass that into the form. I think I like that approach. That feels a little bit cleaner. I'm going to call this function add habit. It will take a habit. It will push onto the habits array, the habit. Pretty simple. Next, we need to get that into our add habit form component. But before we can just pass it straight in there, we have to declare a prop being short for property. To do that in Svelte, you just go into your script tag, you export a declaration of whatever property you want to add. That should do it. That should create a property on this form called addHabit. Flipping back over to the app component, now we can use that new property and we can pass it the function we created, which will now be available in that component. So a property is basically like an attribute that you create on your custom components. It works just like an HTML attribute. You use the name of it, an equal sign, and then assign it whatever value you want it to have, just like you would the source of an image or the type of an input. Since the property and the value we're passing into it have the same name, we can use a shorthand for this, just like that. That only works because the property has the same name as the value we're passing in. Back over here in our form, we now need to put that new function we have in this component to use. I'm going to do that with an event listener on the form. To set up an event listener in Svelte, you use the keyword on, : and then the event that you want to listen for. I want to listen for the submit event of the form. Then the value you give that is whatever you want it to do. I want it to add habit name. Let's see if that works. We don't really know because there is nowhere we can actually look at the value of that right now. Let's flip back over to the app component and just rig up something really quickly. What I want to do is I want to have a simple way to display all the habits. I could just use a div, but then what am I putting in the div? I actually need to iterate over that array that I've created, the habits array, In order to do this in Svelte, I can use an each block. I'll say each habits as habit. Now we're basically looping right here inside our HTML. Then I end it with a / each that ends the block. Now I can get to the value in there like this. Okay, now let's try to add one. I'm not sure if you can see it on the video. I think you can. Every time I'm clicking on add, it's like the whole page is flashing, and I think what's happening is the form is actually submitting. That's not what we want in this case, because we want to be able to control what happens to the form in JavaScript. To fix that, I'm going to flip back over to the form, and I'm going to add an event modifier. What you would normally do with a submit listener is you would prevent the default behavior of the browser. Otherwise, it tries to submit the contents of the form back to the server. We don't want to do that when we are handling the form in JavaScript. The way you do that in Svelte is through this modifier. You use the pipe character after the name of your event, and then you can just use the modifier you want to use. Svelte has a few different modifiers, so you can look those up in the documentation if you need to use other ones in different scenarios. But I think this is the one that we're going to use here, prevent default. That should keep the form from submitting when we either click a button or press return inside the field. And it does prevent the submission, but it doesn't seem to be outputting what I think it should. Let's see if we can figure out why. Here's what I've done to try to troubleshoot. I added a couple of console logs into the add habit function. That serves two purposes. One, if these are getting logged out when I click on this add button, then I know that the function is getting through to the add habit form and that it's being called when it's supposed to, when the form submits. The second purpose of these is to tell me what the actual values are that we're dealing with at that point. So I'm logging out the habit, that's whatever was passed in to the add habit function. Then after a new habit gets pushed onto the habits array, I'm logging out the entire habits array. If you look down here in the console, you can see those logs. This is for each press of this add button. In the first case, the habit was test, and the habits array contained one value that was test. The second press, the habit again was test, and now it has two values. It looks as though the add habit function is behaving exactly as we expect it should. The problem here is that we are not being cognizant of the way that Svelte determines whether a state variable has changed or not. Svelte registers a change on an assignment. Push is not doing an assignment. The array that has been assigned to habits is still assigned to habits, so that has not changed, even though the values inside the array have changed. There's been no assignment there, so as far as Svelte is concerned, this habits variable, the habit state, has not changed at all. In order to work around that, instead of pushing, what we need to do is we need to reassign habits. We can reassign it to the current values spread. So that's the current array spread out into its constituent values plus the new value at the end. I'll leave those logs in for a second just in case this doesn't work, but I think it will. Let's go ahead and close the console to give ourselves more room over here and add a habit. There we go. Now we're seeing it. Let's add it again. Yes. Now that we're actually assigning habits each time, we're assigning it to all of its old values, spread, plus the new value we wanted to add. Now that we're doing that, Svelte can see that it has changed and it needs to update to render the new value. I'll just click refresh over here to get rid of all that. Now I'm going to get rid of these console logs. We don't need this anymore now that everything is working the way we want it to. Next, I'm going to create one thing we haven't accounted for here is that we probably need to be storing more than just the name of the habit. The whole point of the habit tracker is to let you track how many days in a row, or whatever your interval is, but how many of your interval in a row that you have completed your habit, what your streak is. To do that, instead of just storing a string, we probably need to store an object. That's going to be pretty easy to do. All I need to do is when I add a habit, I'm going to change this just for clarity to habit name, because that's really all that's being passed in here. And then down here, I'm going to create the habit, which is an object containing the name, and the streak, which will start out at 0. That is going to break our loop down here, break our code, sorta, not really. It's just going to probably show a string representation of the habit. Actually, let's just try it out and see what it looks like. Oh, okay, right. It's going to show object, object. We could do this. We could change this to habit name, and then habit streak. That's going to look a little bit nicer, but that's still not exactly what we want. So that's okay. I'm going to go back and revise how that's being displayed. I think it makes sense for the habit itself to be a separate component. To do that, I'm going to go over here to my file panel and create a new file. This will be just habit.svelte. And I'm going to set this up just like I've set up the others before, with an empty script tag, an empty style tag, and then just some space for markup at the bottom. Up here in our script, I know this is going to need a property because here in the app, as I'm looping through these habits, I want to be able to pass the habit into the habit component so that it can render it. I'm going to export let habit. Now, what sort of markup do I want here? I think I probably want to just wrap this in a div. I'll have a heading that is the habit name. We'll just make that an h2 heading. Under that, I'm going to have the count. I'm going to put it in a span just in case I want to style it. And actually, maybe I'll go ahead and give that a class to make it easier to style. And we called that streak, I believe is what I called that. Habit.streak. Let me check that and make sure. Yes, I called it streak. And actually, it might be good to be consistent with that. We'll give the class the name streak as well. Switching back over to my app component, I'm going to rip out this and put in my habit component instead. It's not going to like that because I haven't imported it. Let's import it here. Now I need to pass in the habit on that prop, and I can do that the same way since the habit and the prop have the same name. Let's see if this works. That looks pretty good. That's more or less what I had in mind. Let's add another one. Yes. As I was entering those, it occurred to me that I kind of expected the new one to appear on the top of the list. So let's try to reverse this array and see if we can loop through it that way. There we go. Actually, that doesn't quite do what I thought it should do. It is putting the most recent one on top, but they're not necessarily in order after that. I think the easier way to accomplish this is probably to just add them in the order I want them. So instead of adding all the existing habits first, I'll add the new habit first and the existing habits last. Let's try that. There's 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that's better. The habit component isn't quite done yet though, because we currently have no way to increment our streak. To do that, I will add a series of buttons. This one will be did it. So you completed your habit for whatever your interval is. We'll have a button that is missed it. That's going to reset your streak. And then another button will be to delete the habit. In order to make these buttons actually work, I'm going to have to be able to talk back to the habit array, at least for the purposes of deleting habits. I think with the did it and missed it, since all we're doing is modifying the one habit, we're not actually deleting anything. I think I can do those inside this component without having to reach out and grab any other data or get functions passed in from other components. But delete is going to have to operate on the array that holds all the habits. So that one does need to come from this app component. Let's go ahead and write a function to do that. We'll call it delete habit. And what is it going to take? I think it could maybe take the actual habit. Let's try it anyway and see if that works. In general, when you're trying to take something out of an array, you might use the splice method, which modifies the array in place. That's not going to work here in Svelte though, because we need to assign a new value to habits if we want it to be reactive, if we want the UI to update when we make this change. That means instead of splicing, I'm going to reassign. What I'm going to assign is a filtered version of this same array. We'll call this parameter current habit. That's going to be, as we're filtering through, that's going to be the current habit we're looking at. The callback you pass into filter is going to keep anything in the new array that returns a true for whatever your test is, whatever you return out of this callback function. That means we want to keep basically the items where current habit is not equal to the habit we passed in, the one we want to delete. It should be as simple as that, I think. Let's test it out. We're going to need to pass this function through to the habit. So we need another prop on the habit. We're going to say let delete habit. That gives us a prop we can use to pass through our delete habit function from the app component. And then we can just go down here. Since the function itself is the same name as the prop, we can just surround it in curly braces to pass it in that way. Again, the alternative to that is to do this, where the left side of the equal sign is the name of your prop, and then the right side is what you're passing in as the value of that prop. We just don't need that here since they're the same. Let's flip over to the habit and implement that. We're going to say on click equals delete habit. Now, if we create a habit, it should have the 3 buttons. Only the delete button is wired up. Let's see if it actually works. It does not. Now let's find out why. Since this hot reloads, a lot of times some of the errors you get in the console are left over from while you were actually typing your code. So I usually like to pull this up and then use this button to clear out the console, give me a fresh start, and then I'll do what I want to test again. So I'm going to add another habit and then delete. I'm not getting anything in the console. Now we're going to kind of do the same thing we did before. We're going to log some values out and just make sure that we're getting exactly what we think we should be. I want to make sure I'm getting the habit in here. That'll also tell us if this function is actually being called. Now when I hit delete, we should get this output in the console down here. Let's see if that's the case. It's not. That means the function is not being called, and it's up to us to figure out why. Part of the problem is I think we need to be passing in the habit to that function, and the habit or the function needs to be called on the click event. Let's try this again. Okay, that did seem to work. Let's add a couple, just 2 or maybe 3 of them, and delete one so that we can see that it is happening and it's deleting the correct one. This should delete 2. Okay, that looks good. I will go back and clean up that console log since we don't need that anymore. Like I said before, I think we can implement those other 2 buttons right here inside the habit component without having to reach out into any data anywhere else. Let's see if that is actually the case. We'll start with a function I'm going to call increment streak. This one's going to be pretty straightforward. It doesn't even need to take any arguments. It does, however, need to reassign the entire value of the habit, or else we won't re-render. And we may not anyway, since this habit is nested inside of an array. I'm going to have to think about how to get around that. Actually, no, it should be fine because this component is not rendering the whole array, it's only rendering the habit. So as long as we reassign that whole habit, we should be okay. I'm going to start by spreading the existing habit. What this will do, if I left it like that, it would basically give us a new assignment that is an object containing all the keys and values that are in the existing object. So this makes no change. It reassigns it with all the same keys and values. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to come down here and add a new key that is going to be the streak, and it's going to be whatever the current streak is plus 1. What this will do, even though we're already going to have a value for the streak here, whatever it was already, by adding this new streak key with a new value, it will override the old one. It will erase the old one and become the new value for this object for the streak key. Let's put this on our button and see if it works. Increment streak. I'm not sure if I need to call it in here. I think I might, but let's just try it just to be sure. I'm going to add a new habit. My streak is 0. Did it? Oh, okay, I don't have to call it. It knows to call it. The reason I had to call it before with the delete habit is because I needed to pass the habit in. If I click it without doing that, then it's passing in probably the event, and that function doesn't work on the event. It only works on the habit. Since that function is comparing whatever we pass in to the current habit and only excluding things where they match, if we pass in the event, that never matches because that's not a habit. Back over to the habit component. That one's looking good. Now we just need to implement the missed_it function. This is going to reset the streak, and we're going to do that kind of the same way, just by reassigning the habit, whatever the existing value is. This spread is not absolutely necessary. We could do this. We could say name is habit.name. That's going to assign the name key the value of the current name. That would do the same thing, but we'll just keep this spread operator in case sometime down the road we decided to add some more properties to that habit. This will just give us whatever is already there. This time we're going to set the streak to 0. You can see here what I was talking about earlier. As we were typing all this, it was hot reloading and telling us there are unexpected tokens. We know that's the case because we just weren't done typing. I'm going to go ahead and collapse this since we're not using the console at the moment. Now let's do the same thing. Let's put an event listener on our click event for the button. It's going to be reset streak. Let's try it and see if it works. Here we are, we're incrementing our habit. Now we missed a day, it resets back to 0, and then we can start incrementing again. When we are done with this habit, we've already formed the habit and don't need to track it anymore, or for whatever reason we don't care about it anymore, we can hit delete and that goes away. Although it didn't go away until the second click. I'm not sure why. It looks like if you have a value in your streak, the first click of delete resets it. That's an interesting bug. Why would that be? I wonder if the habits are not being passed into the habit component by reference. So when I'm changing the streak value, it's not actually changing it back in the original array, which lives here in our app component. I'm still not sure why it would set it back to 0, though. I don't know why that would happen. Anyway, here's what I'm going to do to try to test this and see why this is happening. I'm going to log out the entire habits array here. When I click on the delete habit button, now put in a habit and test it. Let's go ahead and pull the console open here and just clean it out. Now I will delete this one. Okay, that's what we would expect there. That matches with my expectations. That's without having any streak value. Now we've got a streak of 5. Let's clear this again and see what this value is. Okay, yeah, that's what I was afraid of. This streak value, we're setting it in the habit, but it's not going back up. It's not getting back up into the original array. Before I learned that this change was not going to propagate back up into the array, basically that we're not passing those habits into the habit component by reference, I thought it was a good idea to create these functions inside the app component and then pass them into the habit. But at this point, we're looking at having to pass in two more functions, one for incrementing the streak and one for resetting it back to 0. And that's kind of where I'm going to draw the line. I think two functions, passing those in is reasonable, but now we're getting just a little bit out of hand, which is good for you because it means I'm going to teach you how to use stores in Svelte. I'm going to start by going over here to my files and creating a new file, calling it stores.js. Calling it stores, even though for the time being we're only going to have one store in there, but if we needed to create more later, then we're ready to go. If you're familiar at all with React and Vue, a store is what you might use Redux for if you're a React programmer, or you might use Vuex if you're a Vue programmer. Those are separate libraries you would pull in that would allow you to create state that is available to your entire application at once. In Svelte, this is built right in, and it's really slick. For my money, it's way easier to do, definitely, than Redux and even than Vuex. We're going to import a function called writable because this is going to be a store that we want to be able to read from and write to. This comes from Svelte store. Now we will export out of this file whatever store we want to create, which is going to be habits, and that's going to be a writable, and you pass the initial value into that writable function for your store. We want habits to start out as an empty array, so that's what we're passing in. Flip back over first to our app component. This is actually going to change several things in our app, and while we're working on these, I don't think I have any work to do with the files, creating new files or looking at the structure, so I'm just going to minimize this toolbar. You can do that just by clicking on one of the icons, whatever the active icon is. So mine was Explorer. If I click on it now when it's visible, it'll collapse that down, and then I can just click on it again to bring it back out when I need it later. I need to import that store from the file I created. The store is habits from, and it's coming from stores.js. First, I'm going to show you the longhand way to do this, and then I'll show you a really handy shorthand that's actually way better for most use cases. But here's the longhand way to do it. I'm no longer using this habits since everything is going to and coming out of the store. So I'm just going to recycle this. I'm going to call this habits value. Then I need to subscribe to the store. When you subscribe to a store, it returns you a function that allows you to unsubscribe. So that's what this is going to capture. This variable is going to capture that function that comes back after we subscribe to the store. Now this is our subscription here, .subscribe. We're going to pass it a function that does whatever we want to do with the value that comes back. So this is what's being passed into our callback. That's the value. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to assign that to that variable I just created. That is my subscription. Like I said before, that whole thing, the call to .subscribe to the subscribe method on that store will give me back an unsubscribe function that I can call later so that I don't create a memory leak when this component is destroyed. Speaking of that, that is my next order of business. I'm going to use the onDestroy hook, which is a lifecycle hook. This is a hook that's going to run at a certain point in this component's lifecycle. What I want to happen on destroy of this component is I want to unsubscribe. I won't need the subscription to the store once this component is destroyed. Oh, and also, as my editor is telling me here, I do need to import that from somewhere. It just comes from plain old Svelte. That is the longhand way to subscribe to a store. Svelte also has a feature called auto subscription that gives us the shorthand method, and it's so much better. I promise you're going to love it. Okay, all we need to do is we can get rid of all of this code, all of this boilerplate code. All we have to do is if we refer to this store that we imported with a $sign in front of the name, that represents the auto subscription to that store. All that's done for us, the subscription, the unsubscribing when the component's destroyed, so we don't have to do any of that. That just means I need to go down through this file, and every reference I have to habits, I need to change to $habits. I can get rid of this, I'm no longer using that. That should be everything. I'm going to collapse this noisy console here. Now, the next nice thing about this is I no longer have to have these functions over here in a component that's not actually using them. I can move those into the place where I'm going to actually call them from. Let's put this one here inside the add habit form. I don't need this prop anymore, but I will need to also import the store in all these other files. I'm just going to grab this because I'm lazy at typing. I'm going to drop it in above my declaration there. Flip back over to app.svelte. It's still trying to pass that through, so I'm just going to get rid of that. Don't have that, don't need to pass it through anymore. And I can do the same thing with delete habit, moving it over. I'll just go ahead and get rid of that prop here, go to the habit, got increment streak, reset streak, and now delete habit, all right here in the habit component. What is the editor telling me here? I have a feeling I'm not going to be able to see. I think it's upset though because my parameter name is the same as the name of my prop here. That is a very bad idea, so I don't really want to do that. I'm going to start calling this one habit to delete. I kind of like that better anyway. Habit to delete. Still doesn't like it, and I'm not sure why. I'm also going to get rid of this. I don't need that prop anymore. Now, all we have to do is import our store, and that should be good. Copy and paste it right out of here. Okay, let's test adding and removing habits just to make sure those still do work. Looks like adding is okay. Now, deleting. That appears to work. Let's just try our streaks and see if those work. I think we might still have the same problem though. Yeah, still the same issue as before, so we need to fix that. Now, doing the increment and the reset, I think is going to be just a little bit convoluted, mostly because I need to do an assignment in order for the reactivity to work. Let's set habits to a new value, and to get that value, we're going to map through the existing habits array. I'm going to need to do what I did with the delete habit and pass in the habit on both of these, both the reset streak and increment streak. So I'm just going to put habit to increment, and here we'll name this parameter habit to reset. All this is going to do is if current habit is the habit to increment, I'm going to return the current habit, except the streak is going to be the current habit streak plus 1. In every other case, I'm just going to return the current habit, not making any change there. I can do a similar thing here to reset the streak, except I don't have to add 1. Instead, I'm just going to set that to 0. Let's see if that works. Oh, forgot to change the name of habit to increment. Here in the reset function, it should be habit to reset. All right, let's reset it. There we go. Now we should be able to have whatever streak value we want and still delete. That does work. Let's create a few of them just to be sure. Okay, let's do some of our test habits here. Reset one. All seems to work. Let's delete the second one, delete that one, and now the top one. think everything there is working. One thing I'm noticing as I'm entering some of these habits is I really think when you add a habit, it should probably clear out this field so that you can type a new name for your next habit. I think the easiest way to do that, given what we have so far, is to just get a handle on that form by binding this. I'm going to call this add habit form. I think that will work. Okay. Now I can bind this. I'm going to bind that value to add habit form. What this will do is this will give me a state variable called add a habit form, which will contain a reference to this form element that I bound this on. I should be able to come down here after I set the new value of habits and say add habit form dot reset. That is just a method that any form element in HTML has. It has a reset method that just allows you to blank out all the values in the form. Let's see if that works. That looks good. Lastly, I would want to go in and just spruce this up a little bit, make it look a little bit nicer. All the styles that we enter in these style tags inside a Svelte component, these are all scoped, so they'll only apply to the component you're working in. There are still ways to write styles that would apply to your entire application, so don't worry about that, but I don't think we'll get into that in this app. I want to start by making our div a flexbox so that we can change the arrangement of the elements inside. I don't want them to look like that, but we'll slowly refine this, and it'll start to take shape. I'm going to set the wrap property to wrap. What this will do is this will allow me to set some of the elements to different widths to sort of influence how everything is laid out. Here's a quick example of one thing I know I want to do. I want to make this H2 100% width so that it's on a line by itself. I think I want the same thing for the streak span, so I'm just going to add it to this selector. Okay, that's pretty good. I also would like the buttons to line up underneath that, so I'm going to change the justify content to center on the flex box. Okay, we're getting there. We've still got a ways to go. The margins around the H2 are a little bit odd, especially on the bottom. It doesn't really look like it's part of that block. It looks like it's just sort of floating off on its own. I'm going to set the margin bottom to a much smaller value so that it looks like those things are together. Now everything is kind of jumbled up though, and I want some breathing room between each of my habits. So I'm going to add a margin top on each of those. Make it 20 pixels. I'm being kind of lazy here with my styling. Pixels are not the ideal measurement to use, but you can use whatever units you would like. I would like the streak to be much more prominent. I think that's really important when you're trying to track habits. I think you need to be able to see that. It needs to be right up in your face. So let's make that 3M. Is that crazy? I don't think so. I think that's okay. It does probably need a little bit more room underneath to give the buttons some space. Maybe a 5 pixel margin bottom is too much. What does 0 look like? I think I like that better. I'm just gonna do a margin bottom of 0 on that H2. Let's put a background on this. Just a nice subtle gray color so that we can see where one habit ends and the next one begins. And that's also gonna need some padding, maybe more than that. That is better. That actually highlights the fact that we've got a ton of top padding on this H2, or sorry, top margin. I think I'm just going to make all the margins 0. That way we have a little bit more control over how things are laid out. Okay, this is starting to improve. Let's put some spacing between the buttons. The way I'm going to do this is if a button has a sibling that's another button, that's what that plus means in CSS, that's an adjacent sibling, then it needs to have a margin on the left. Let's try 5 pixels. That's better. How does 10 pixels look? That's not too bad. I think that's pretty good. Okay, let's also increase the size of the text in our buttons. I don't want it anywhere near as big as some of this other text. I think that's probably good. It'd be nice if they had a little bit more padding too. Maybe even more on the left and right. Yeah, those are much nicer. We need some way to point out that this third button is not like the others. So I'm going to do an nth of type selector for the third button and make the background maroon. Yes, I think that's good. But we don't have enough contrast with the text, so the text should also be white. I don't especially like the button borders, and I think it would be cool to maybe have colors for all the buttons. I'm not a designer, so if I were a designer, I might not want that. Maybe it's too noisy, but I like to have some sort of other way to indicate what I'm doing besides just the label. Let's try a dark green background on did it, and we'll make the color for that one white as well, so you've got enough contrast there. The missed it button, make it a yellow background maybe? It's a little louder than the others. Is there a dark yellow? No, there's not. What about an orange? It's not quite right, but it's something, I guess. All right, now that they have backgrounds, we can take the borders off. That's a little bit cleaner. I feel like they need to be even bigger though now, maybe some more padding. Maybe this needs to be 10 on the top and bottom, and maybe the left and right should be 15, maybe 20. Yeah, I like that. I'm a fan of big, chunky buttons. Let's revisit our habit form. It's starting to look a little neglected. So what we can do in terms of styling here. Let's make our label much larger. Maybe not much larger, but a little bit larger. Let's go there. And we're already starting to have some alignment problems. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm also going to make this form a flexbox. I really like flexbox because it makes it so easy to align everything the way you want it. I'm going to use align items center. That didn't quite do what I had hoped. Oh, okay, this may be because our label is wrapped around the input. Let's change that, which means in order to keep this successful, I need to name this field. I'm going to call it habit name, and then I need to set this label with a for attribute so that screen readers know which field this labels. Okay, now everything's lining up much better. I also want to justify content because I want this to be centered above the habits. There we go. While we're making fonts bigger, I think I just want everything to be this same size. Yeah, I think that looks not too bad. Now we need spacing. I'm just going to put the margins on either side of the input. We'll just do a shorthand margin. Top is 0, top bottom are 0, and then 10 pixels left and right. No, I don't think that's right. I think that's good for the button, not so much for the label. The label probably needs less. So let's say top right is 10 pixels, bottom is 0, and then left we'll do 3 pixels. That reinforces the relationship between those two items a little bit better, I think. Maybe even go a little bit more on this right margin. That's pretty good. Let's get rid of this button's border just to be consistent with the others. Oh, that's not good at all. You can't really tell where the button begins and ends. It doesn't really look like a button even, I would say. What if we just made the border a different color? 1 pixel solid. And what if we made it maybe CCC? That's probably too light. Pro tip, you can go further up in the alphabet to get darker grays. And then once you run out of alphabet, like here I am at AAA, if this is not enough, I can go to 999, 888. 000 is just black. So that's what we had before. 444, 333. That's pretty dark. Yeah, so maybe something like 999. That's pretty good. It would be nice for it to have a little bit more padding. I don't think it needs as much as the others though. And maybe it's nice to have this the same height as the field. So what if we tried to hit that mark? That's roughly it, I think. Apparently I hit the button at some point with no text in the field, which gave us an undefined habit. It would probably be good to just write something so that that can happen. We need to do that in the add habit form. What we can do is go right up here at the top of our function and say, if not habit name, then return. Now, if we click this with nothing in it, nothing happens. And then if we have a value, it's going to give us a new habit. Thanks for joining me to build the Habit Tracker app in Svelte. I hope you enjoyed working with the framework. I really enjoyed it. It requires a lot less boilerplate code, especially than React and even than Vue, which I think in general doesn't require you to write a lot of boilerplate code. Svelte requires even less. And then of course having the advantages to your users of a smaller bundle to download and quicker performance is great too. That's all for now, and I hope to see you back in the next video.